Thank you very much. So there's a few Democracy for America people here. It's actually a very important anniversary of our campaign. It's the 10th anniversary of the What I Want to Know speech, when I basically told the Democrats what the hell was the matter with them for voting for Bush's stuff. So there's a very apropos evening to talk to what I think is one of the really bright lights of the next generation. I'm very interested in this generation. It's how we got to know each other. I'm still trying to write a book about this generation. David did write a book about this generation, which we're going to find out about it in a minute. But it's an extraordinary generation, and it powered Barack Obama to the presidency. This generation revitalized everything and used my campaign as a model. And everybody says, "Oh, well, Howard Dean, the internet guy." I don't know anything about the internet. I'll just confess right up front. What we did was we hired a lot of really smart 23-year-olds and let them do what they wanted, and they figured this stuff out. So I think this is an extraordinary generation. This generation, I think it's going to change everything. And David's written a fantastic book about that and about all the institutions and some of the effects that are going to be having. And we're going to talk about that tonight too. The first question I have for you, David, is a very broad-based question, which is, why did you write this?
Well,
you want to switch it
on? Play this on? Well, first of all, thank you, Howard, for doing this, and thank you to the Strand for being here. This is one of my favorite bookstores in the world, and I have been in this rare book room many times buying books and throughout this store. And whenever I'm anywhere else, I always say, when am I going to get back to the Strand? When is the next time I'm going to get to Strand? So luckily I live a few blocks from here, so I can get here perhaps too often for my checkbook. I wrote this book because I really believe in this generation, and I had this experience during the 2008 election cycle. As Jessica alluded to, I ran an organization called Generation 18, which I still run, which is dedicated to engaging young people in politics. And I'd made this film called 1808, interviewed 100 members of Congress all over the country, talking about how to get this generation involved. And then, given the nature of the 2008 campaign, which I didn't really know when I started making the film in 2006, what that campaign was going to look like, it sort of took off, and we did over 1,000 events all over the country. And between 2007 and 2008, it took me to every corner of America to talk to young people who were excited about being part of what was happening in 2008, being part of the election. But what I started to notice towards the end of the campaign was I would go to these places and these people would say, I'm excited to vote, but I also am starting a business. I'm starting an organization, and I care about the environment, and I'm trying to find ways to be active on those issues. And it struck me as unique that people were wanting to take that activism to the next level in the ways people were thinking about how to manifest it. And at the same time, I started getting people, would email me and say, you should really meet this guy. He's started a business. You should meet this person. They started an organization. I was like, this is unusual. I don't think there have always been this many young people doing this kind of work. So at the same time, I was also reading these articles in, magazines and books that are coming out. There's one called The Dumbest Generation. There was one called Generation Me. I think the subtitle was something, how this epidemic of narcissism and the worst employees in history, all these kind of labels. And incidentally, all these things were written by people who were from a different generation, not surprisingly. And so I felt like, someone from this generation had to tell this generation story, and that it's important to get that out there. So that's sort of why I wanted to write the book.
So let's talk a little bit about this, because it's interesting. The notion of the worst employees ever is an interesting one, because you flip it on its head. What you do is tell a story. You tell many stories in this book, and it's a terrific book. You should run down and buy it immediately. But the sub theme of it's not really a sub theme. The theme of the book is a group of people your age who are doing things very differently, which is, I suppose, why some older people think that you're the worst employees ever. But the fact of the matter is, the other side of that coin is they can't hire you if they expect the institution not to be fundamentally changed. So why don't you start by talking a little bit about institutions? David also writes for Fast Company, which is a online, how would you describe it, an online business magazine, but it's
tech, innovation, creativity.
Talk a little bit about not just the impact that your generation is having on large, relatively stodgy institutions, but what you think is going to come out of that 10 or 15 years from now.
So as Howard alluded to, one of the big ways this generation is making an impact is the way we're transforming sort of corporate America. And they're doing that in three different ways. One is through sort of our consumer power, voting with our dollars, so to speak. So millennials say they will overwhelmingly switch brands if they feel that the brand they're switching to shares their values and cares about the same issues that they care about. And so we've made that known to companies that we care about that, and so that's affected what kind of things they get involved with, what kind of policies they adopt. The second way is through our employee power, which is something that I don't think people have really thought about before. How does a group of employees make an impact just by how they prefer to work? And this generation, obviously people need young people. Young people are a fundamental way that companies work because they can hire you cheaply, and you work hard and you work long hours, and people are happy to do that when they're young. But one of the top questions that human resources people and recruiters get from young people is, what is your commitment to social responsibility? How flexible can my work hours be? Can I work from home? Do you allow that option? What's your policy on devices in the office? Can I bring my own devices? Do I have to have a work device? Things like this are new questions, and certainly new to be getting at the very top as some of the most important things for people in this generation. So we want a more flexible environment, and we want to feel like the work we're doing has impact. 80% of millennials will actually take a job that pays them less if they believe that job can have greater social impact. So that puts the onus on bigger companies to at least be able to offer, okay, we're not a nonprofit that's doing all these different things, but they have to be able at least to offer some social value that they're providing. So that's been a big way that millennials have helped push that. And then on the third side of that, it's through our power as entrepreneurs. This is a generation of people who have come of age in a time where they've had to create their own opportunity, create their own jobs, and we're seeing the kind of businesses that people in this generation are starting be more socially minded, not purely focused on how do I make the most amount of money possible, where do I find this little hole in the market where I can totally kill it. More targeted around even a company, when you look at a company like Facebook, which is obviously a for-profit company, if you look at sort of the documents in the filing of the company that before it went public, there's a very clear statement that says we have a social mission as a company. We believe in making the world more open and connected. Now you can say what you want about Facebook, but that's not something that has been in sort of the securities filings documents of a major company before. And I think that is indicative of the kind of way that people think about business. We view business as a vehicle for social change, which I think to older generations seems somehow antithetical.
So what do you think the impact of the so-called Great Recession has been on the tail end of the millennials? Millennials are generally described, I think, as those born between 1980 and 2000, and there's kids getting out of college today who are having a very difficult experience trying to find employment. What's the impact on that? What have you done, not you, but what has your generation done in terms of your own way of coping with the difficulties in finding a job?
Well, it's interesting because we talk about how this generation has come of age, And if you look at the ways that this generation has responded to the crisis, it's actually been fairly, I think, promising, because we've displayed a continued sense of optimism, first of all, throughout the crisis, despite being burdened with debt and high unemployment. For youth unemployment is disproportionately higher than other demographics, and yet, as the economic crisis has gotten worse, millennials have become more optimistic about their own economic future in the long term. If you look at the Depression and the ways in the Depression that you think about the culture, you think about the sense of, is this ever going to end, that was there. That is something that is not present today, because the title of the book, Fast Future, is about the ways that in 1 year so much can change in a way that it didn't 10 years ago. The amount of change that's produced in a single year is greater than some entire centuries, and millennials understand that, and we see that things may be bad right now, but we know that so much could change in the next year or 2 years that ultimately we'll be fine on the other side of this. So there's really a sense of optimism and a resilience that I think was formed very early in our consciousness. All the crises and national tragedies that this generation faced. People forget that Columbine happened at a very formative moment. A lot of millennials experience being a middle schooler and having and learning that people had been shot in a place in your own country. It was kind of overwhelming, and you think about 9/11, you think about all these experiences. So we have this ability to bounce back and be resilient, and that's definitely shown itself in the economic crisis. And it's not surprising that we've seen, again, this rise in entrepreneurialism as a result of that, people turning to that kind of work.
So I guess a very broad question is, how do you think you got this way? Not you, but how do you think your generation got this way? I mean, obviously some of it is the development of the internet, but that can't be all of it, because it's how the internet's used makes a difference.
Well, it's a couple things. So 9/11 is a big moment for this generation, and I actually put the definition of millennials to be people born a little bit between sort of 1980 and the mid 90s, because I sort of believed that for the group of millennials I'm talking about in this book, there's an important moment that happened with 9/11, which sent a sort of a shock wave of service through everyone in the country, but particularly affected millennials, because we were forming our identities at that moment. We were figuring out, what am I going to do with my life, or what are going to be the core values that are going to guide me. So some people went and joined the military. Some people went and joined civic organizations, and that spirit has stayed with this generation throughout. I think that's a big piece of it. I think the growing up in this fast future world where we have the upper hand over other generations, because we know how this all works, in large part because we helped create some of these technologies. I mean, let's not forget that companies like Facebook, like Twitter, like Tumblr, that are affecting people of all generations, not just this generation, but are affecting the core businesses and the ways that people do business all over the world are created by people in this generation. So everyone in this generation has a much deeper understanding of how to operate in a world in which those are the tools and platforms that govern how we all live. And again, that gives us sort of this really distinct advantage, which I think is really important.
So that leads to the next question. The title of the book is Fast Future, and one of the big points of discussion, particularly in the section that's sort of about the business community, and which you've alluded to, is the nature of institutions being insufficient to be fast enough. So one of my theses about what's happening to the country now, and to some extent the world, is that you have three major institutions that are failing in this country. The first and most obvious is Congress. The next one is the mainstream media, which has become really an entertainment vehicle and not a news vehicle at all. And finally, Wall Street, which is important for allocating capital, and it's really basically failed to do that. So you come along and you have this generation which goes to work, but it's where it's important to have social values. What happens when you run into an institution which has lost its way, which is not changing in a positive way, which doesn't appreciate the values of the millennials, and which is resisting the values of the millennials. How does that, I mean, what do you, I know what the answer is, yeah, you're going to overcome it all. Well, of course you will, because we're all going to die off. But what I'm really interested in is, how does that overcoming look? What process do you think is going to happen to when you guys get to be my age?
Well, I'll sort of take those institutions one by one. So Congress, there was a very interesting quote yesterday from Aaron Schock, who's a Republican congressman from Illinois, who's one of the youngest members of Congress, and I interviewed him for the book, and he talked about how he sort of fought his way onto the Ways and Means Committee, as a freshman representative, which is pretty hard to do, and basically his argument was, hey, you're making decisions about young people. I'm a young person. That voice should be in the room. So he said yesterday that if you took the 40 members of Congress under 40 and you locked them all in a room, that they'd solve all the big problems that are facing us, and come out the next day. And I mean, it's a little bit facetious, but I think there's something to that. I think there's something to the perspectives of young people and being more open to doing things just a different way, and not being as entrenched in the system. And I think what we definitely need to see is we need to see more young people running for office.
Before you leave the Congress and go on to Wall Street and the mainstream media, but the Congress is notorious for this. So the reason that the 40 people at different parties don't get together and solve all the problems, which I actually agree with you they could, is because they are being integrated into a system which is based on seniority and which is doing the same old thing they've always done. So there's an enormous pressure on the young people that are in Congress to be co-opted and not to sit down and have those kinds of caucuses. Right. And that's one of the core parts of the question I'm asking you. How do you stop that? How do you prevent that from happening?
I think a big piece of that is getting the people who should be in Congress. And what I mean by that is, if you think about Teddy Kennedy, for instance, I would venture to say that if he were coming up in the world today, he would not go into politics. Maybe he would, but maybe he would start a social enterprise on the south side of Boston to teach kids how, like the Harlem Children's Zone here, to focus on education. People like that who got into politics because they were viewed it as a form of service, public service, not as a career, and who viewed a positive contribution that they could make, and they cared about issues, they cared about the poor, they cared about education. And today, those young people are not going into politics. They're going into social entrepreneurship. They're going to start green energy companies. They're going to do that kind of work. And there needs to be a call to those kind of people to run for office, because we're losing that great crop of potential public servants to these incredibly promising other kinds of sectors. Because if I can go and say, I can raise a bunch of money and go build a school in Africa and have it up and running and teaching classes in 1 year, why would I ever go to Congress if I could do that? So that's part of the thing that we have to do. And I think it's incumbent upon this generation to get more engaged in running for office in the electoral system. We're voting. It's that's not the issue, but we're not actively participating in running for office at the kind of levels we should, and the right people aren't doing it. But I think that maybe we'll see that start to change as some of the dynamics start to change a little bit. I mean, it's interesting to look at how millennials help push some of the gay marriage conversation forward over the past several years. Richard Burr, conservative senator from North Carolina, said when he voted for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there's a new generation of young people. They have a different way of thinking. It doesn't, I don't agree with it, but I'm going to vote for this because it's changing. And Barack Obama cited that when he changed his position on gay marriage. So, and now as a country, you even saw in the last election, people thought that Republicans were going to make a big issue out of gay marriage, and Obama coming out for that, and it was hardly touched. And I think a lot of that was attributable to people realizing that young people's views are changing, doing and not wanting to sort of alienate people on something like that. So we're already having that effect of nudging, if you will, the political process away.
So there is a really interesting book that was the title of which escapes me because they used it twice. It came out about 7 or 8 years ago. This is going to segue into Wall Street, and it talks about people who get out of school with an enormous amount of debt. These are millennials. They go to work on Wall Street because they can't find another way to pay off these $200,000 or $300,000 worth of college and graduate school loans. So there's an area where young people go into industries which, in my opinion, are also failing in terms of what they're supposed to be doing for the country. Talk a little bit about that. And if you want to expand it to talk about the Fortune 500 in general, I think that's fine. I'm not sure the Fortune 500 are failing, but I'm pretty sure Wall Street is. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the schism in your generation between those who get out of graduate school with a huge amount of debt and end up working for Goldman or someplace like that, and the people who don't really have any relationship to that at all?
So I think that Wall Street is going to look perhaps a little bit different 10 years from now. I don't think it will be totally transformed. And part of the reason for that is that in a group of 80 million people, there are always going to be people who want to make money. And lest, you all think we're sitting here saying this is just a pure generation of nothing but altruistic world changers, unfortunately that's not true. It will never be true of any generation of people. But what I'm seeing, and we're talking about, is sort of the most promising aspect of this generation that's having this kind of impact. So there will always be a constituency for Wall Street. There will always be that constituency there. What I think you may start to see is the millennials who are going to work on Wall Street, more of them now don't have an optimistic or positive perception of the places they're going to work. So there's an internal push. There's internal, when I meet someone who works at a financial firm, they sort of apologize.
It's just big bane at random.
Right. So they sort of apologize. They're like, oh, so what do you do? They're like, I work at Goldman Sachs, and I'm like, there's, and I think that's a shift because people used to be incredibly proud to say that. People used to feel like that was a marker of the success that they'd achieved and that they'd had risen to the top. And of course, it's incredibly good thing for people to do. But I think that the cultural perception of the institution has changed. For the UCLA freshman survey, which sort of ranks, it's been a pretty good marker of youth attitudes for a long time, ranked 2 years ago, found that business was no longer the most popular major among young people, which it had been for a long time. And that, I think, is a good indicator of how this generation feels about going into that kind of corporate mindset. So we may start to see smaller changes in those institutions, and some of that may come in the way they are, so the ways they do social responsibility. But I'll tell you one thing: the payment system and the forms of ways that people are transferring money, that's something that millennials are going to play a big role in changing. You look at the frustration with credit card companies and the way that they do business. There are a lot of young people who are starting alternative payment methods to credit cards. There's a company out of Iowa called Dwala, which has had a lot of success. There's this idea of Bitcoin and some of these other companies out of San Francisco. And I think that revolution is going to start to come because as a young person, I don't see why it shouldn't be easier to move my money, to send my money, to have more of it on my cell phone. And companies have understood some of that, and they've started to ramp up what you can do in that regard. But why should I have to pay these fees to do these different things? So there's a lot of room there, and we're starting to see some disruption in that regard. I think we're also going to see some of the same thing at some point in terms of health, in terms of the way that healthcare companies are just could not be further apart from how millennials want to manage their health, and from at every level, from finding information to customer service to having access on their devices and mobile information.
So the last, well, it might end up being the second to last, but the last question before we open this up a little bit is the third part of the question I asked you, which is the media as a failing institution. and what is the impact that your generation is going to have on that. I mean, I think most people widely believe that there'll be no such thing as what we would today consider television in 10 years, that people will have everything in their computer. Most of the people that I know who are your age don't watch anything when it's broadcast. They just watch it when it's convenient for them to watch it. And I know that because I'm on Twitter, and when I tweet that I'm going to be on such and such a show, I'll start getting comments about 5 days later, oh, great show, great show. So, but of course this is a much deeper problem. The really deep problem is that media has become entertainment, not news, and what is posed as news, and we're not just talking about Fox, which is clearly not news, but we're talking about lots of companies that really don't.
Well, what's about to happen at CNN, if any of you missed their wall-to-wall cruise coverage the other day, it's about to turn into a celebrity news network, CNN.
Well, I would argue that most of television has turned into a celebrity news network. So
I was on MSNBC today, and they introduced me by playing clips from the Jersey Shore and Girls to talk about the Millennials, which had really nothing to do with the rest of my interview.
Snooki wrote a blurb for the back.
Yeah, that's right. Endorsed by Snooki and Governor Dean here.
Great company. I knew there was a liaison there someplace.
So as you point out, these people have to make money, and I think that there's a degree to which certainly we romanticize the point at which media didn't have to make money. I think the problem was that the budgets of news organizations perhaps were smaller, their scope was smaller, but there are always conversations about, are we going to put this on the air or not, because of what the corporate overlords might think, all the way back to the beginning of journalism. But I think that the millennials have actually, surprisingly, while there are lots of people who are going to watch the Jersey Shore and more entertainment, cultural, stuff like that, I think millennials have actually shown that they care about high value content. Because of Twitter, because of Facebook, it's not so much about, can you deliver me, what happened, because we're getting that on a regular basis. It's about, what can you add, what kind of perspective can you add, what can you give me depth, which is why you see the young youth readership and loyalty to things like the New York Times, to NPR. When I was on NPR this morning, and I couldn't believe how many young people, millennials, were calling into the show. There's a constituency for meaningful, thoughtful conversation in this generation. 60 Minutes, actually, this is something that I find fascinating. In the past 2 years, its viewership among 18 to 30-year-olds has actually increased, as shocking as that may seem. And it's because in an age where we're having so much entertainment-based content and we're getting the news, when you look at CNN or MSNBC or Fox, what they do all day is deliver information. And they deliver, here's what's happened, here's what this person has said, here, let's talk about it. And we're getting all that. We don't need that in any more than one sentence in a tweet. What we're looking for is who can go deeper, where can there be that kind of deeper intellectual conversation. So I think that those attitudes will be manifest. Someone at some point is going to come up with a great news network for the next generation. It's going to be all online. It's going to be video based. It's going to, trim the fat of big camera budgets and operations, and it's going to have those sort of fresh perspectives talking about these things. And it may very well be a person in this generation who starts that and makes that happen. But I'm more optimistic about it. And there are also people in this generation who are doing non-traditional forms of journalism. There are more young people who are writing. The number of people who can count themselves as writers or bloggers or journalists today is huge. And there are people there are voices that are emerging in that regard. There are people who are newly empowered to do that. So I think that's also something that I think is good. And the barrier to trusting that is gone. When you ran for president and people talked about the bloggers, people said, who are you embraced them, and that's something that really helped you. But a lot of people had a very negative perception of what it meant to be a blogger, that you were illegitimate, that you were some angry person in your pajamas. And I think now that writing online has been totally legitimized. And having a blog is there's really very little bias against that. There's still some, but it's nowhere near the way it was before. So it gives young people the ability to bypass that and actually have a voice.
Great. I think we're going to stop and go to Q&A. And it means I have to give you the microphone, right? Oh, you have your own. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm very fascinated by the... Ooh. What should I do? Is that better?
Speak.
Okay. I'm fascinated by the culture of generations. And there was a book that came out, I'm sure you know what it is. It was written by a baby boomer woman and a Gen X guy that I had seen them speak about it in 2003. And they talked about how Generation X and the Millennials, the World War II generation, and the baby boomers. And I realized then that I'm very much a Gen Xer. I'm at the bottom end of it. I was born in 1975. But I had always thought that, in different ways about how I looked at things, that maybe it was because I was a woman or because I grew up in the suburbs or because I'm from a WASPy family. And these people writing about this and talking about some of the issues you're talking about made me realize it's because I'm a Gen Xer. And I thought that one thing that was fascinating in what they said about the difference between Generation X and the Millennials is that Generation X has an inherent distrust for institutions, whereas Millennials feel that they deserve to be judged on their own merits. So I was wondering if either one of you have a perspective on that, Governor Dean, based on what you saw with some of those 23-year-olds that you hired in Vermont. I was actually 28 when I quit my job and became a Deaniac.
Well, I think that there's definitely a sense that this generation doesn't feel like they need to sort of be told what to do. And I think that there's a freer sense of spirit in the way that the power has been pushed down, in which started, I think, with a lot of the stuff that happened in 2004 when blogs not just started to affect politics, but started to affect all areas of our society. So that, I think that pushing down of power has now transcended to organizations. 10 years ago, if you wanted to go, help save the world, there were a couple big organizations. You could go work for Amnesty International. You could go work for, maybe the Red Cross, organization like that. Now, those organizations are actually having problems attracting young people because the roles they give young people are as a clerical person or something in fundraising or an associate. And so people say, well, I could go start my own thing and it could be smaller, but I could see that impact on the ground. So I would actually say that there's been a real change in how people can go out and act. The process of starting a business has been totally demystified. 15% of people directly out of college are starting their own businesses today, which is increase of 300% from where it was 20 years ago. So there's a real sense that that's possible, that I could go do that. And when you live in that understanding of those possibilities, it leads to, I think, what we're seeing now, which is this sort of continued ability for people to go out and make their own change.
Hi, David. So you and I have talked about kind of talent flow a little bit, but I'm really curious for everyone to kind of hear your thoughts on that. You mentioned higher education as a debt vehicle that's kind of driving people towards Wall Street, but I'd be curious to know how you view higher education institutions and the role that those young people who are opting out of that system or who are taking non-traditional passive education are then supposed to flow into this traditional political system and run for office, and how we transform these higher education institutions and also the public school system in order to shift talent flow inherently, and how we're teaching and empowering young people, and then how we're viewing those young people who follow the system versus who don't.
It's a great question, and I think that this is something that I care a lot about. I went to Gallatin at NYU, not too far from here, and the model of Gallatin is, some of you may be familiar with it, but it's a pretty non-traditional program that believes in experiential education. That my major was the intersection of film, technology, and politics, with an emphasis on youth and social change. So that was my major, and I took writing this book as an independent study that I got credit for. I took filmmaking projects as independent studies, and I did a lot of work in that regard. And we're seeing more of that with, the cost of higher education increasing and the outcomes decreasing in a lot of ways. The idea that, a college diploma is now becoming just something you have to pay for in order to get into the very base level of jobs that are being offered. Young people are looking for different paths. People are thinking about, are there ways that I can, do other kind of work? And unfortunately, the only thing that seems to be, on average, more expensive than going to college is not going to college. But there are, as Rebecca alluded to, there are a handful of young people who are breaking out of this mold, and we're starting to see more of them. People who are, leaving school and trying to start things. But I think it's a sort of a tragedy that we look at, Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, two of the people who've created some of the greatest impact on the way we're living, and Steve Jobs for that matter, all of them dropped out of college in order to do what they had to do. And I think our institutions of higher education, which are in a lot of ways resistant to change, have to adapt and recognize that you can't sort of just have a world that's walled off in an ivory tower anymore. That idea of an ivory tower is perhaps more relevant to be, cracked than ever. And I think we're starting to see the things that are happening with MOOCs and the things that are happening with Khan Academy, some of the stuff that's happening with ways of streaming lectures. All that there's no substitute for in-class, conversation and participation, but we're starting to allow that intellectualism that you could only get in a college environment to open up, and we're going to see more of that, and young people are leading part of the charge to make that happen. I don't know if you have, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I'd rather hear yours, so.
Well, no, you first.
This will get more, I'd rather have the questions.
Okay. Well, first of all, full disclosure, I was born right in between the Generation Xers and right before the Millennials, so I hate both generations. But, no, I don't actually. But anyhow, you mentioned, it was mentioned at the introduction, the work that you did setting up your own, youth vote, outreach organization. And so I'm guessing you probably know about like ourtime.org, which is
very good friends with them. And we actually did our last film with them that we did in 2012.
And I went to an event that they and the Insight Labs did, where this idea of a changing sense of agency is sort of really underlying a lot of the sort of changes and shifts in thinking that you talked about, where millennials tend to, growing up in a digital age, it's kind of like, click and response. It's like, a desire for instant feedback, tangibility sort of drives. For instance, you said why somebody would start up their own nonprofit to dig wells in Africa rather than, work for an established, nonprofit that's been doing that for 40 years. But the sort of two questions I have that come out of that, because it's like I love this idea of a much more entrepreneurial approach to democracy, to solving problems. But if everybody is kind of going into starting up their own things, are any of these efforts going to ever acquire the scale necessary to challenge institutions like governments or major corporations or banks? And will any of them bother to acquire or want to acquire what wisdom some established institutions like some nonprofits maybe have, where they can say, it's like, look, we've been doing this for 40 years. If you're going to build the wells, do it this way, not that way. It's like, structure things that way. And so that's sort of the two things I'm wondering might be lost. And
so the change that we're talking about here is, as you say, in this sense of having this sense of agency, which I think is very different and incredibly important. But you're right that not everybody can be a founder, not everybody can start their own thing, but there's nothing wrong with trying that. And I think we've started already to see people who are starting things and then they're either folding them into other organizations who acquire them, and either it's a learning experience or the organization then is able to help scale it in some degree. But we are seeing like anything else, not, the overwhelming majority of things are not successes. The most are failures, and it's a few that are able to reach scale and have impact. But if you look at a couple different millennial focused companies, like Airbnb is a good example. So that is helping, slowly but surely shake up a hotel and transportation and travel business. If you look at it's Zipcar, which just got acquired by Avis. So that's an example of, okay, Avis now realizes that they're going to lose out on the new trend in how people get cars, but people are still going to be sharing those cars, and the model is still going to exist, and millennials are helping to scale in that way. So I also think there's some degree of self-correction when people start to see a proliferation of organizations and there's limited resources, just like in any other time period. Ultimately, that leads to some failure of some of those organizations. People realize there's not enough steam to keep going. And we're starting to see more of them reach a level of scale and institutionalization. But remember, a lot of this has only been going on for 4 years. And I think the results of particularly some of these social entrepreneurship endeavors 4 years out are pretty impressive so far.
Questions?
Go ahead. I was just going to add, it may be that you don't need to scale in some cases. The offshoot of Teach for America, I think inner city education is going to be changed by 25-year-olds or 20-year-olds that have gone through TFA and started their own charter schools. Certainly nothing has been done in inner city education for the last 40 years until this came along. And it's far from perfect. But it occurs to me that you may have multiple models that never have to get scaled. You just have lots and lots of people doing this on a small level, which because of the internet and the ability to share information and coordinate, you don't actually have to have an institution that leads to the scaling. You just have multiple individuals doing slightly different things. The one thing about this generation, which David didn't talk about, which I think is remarkable, is most of the things that get done are measured. And you could give Gates credit for this, and so they don't give money away unless there's metrics. And most of the people that I know in this young generation are unlike our generation. We talked a lot, and we did do some things, but we talked a lot. And there was a lot of money that went towards something that sounded like a good idea that was never really proved. I don't know too many of these guys that don't insist that they measure their outcomes so that they don't go down paths that are just based on bloviation and theory, which was very big in the years that I was in college.
Well, we'll get to the question in a second, but that just brings up a great point, which is that if you think about the idea of doing something as a project, not believing that you're going to commit necessarily your entire life to this endeavor. Millennials are replacing a lot of, foreign aid is a good example. So, foreign aid money that was just sort of getting doled out and farmed out through a system. Millennials are saying, okay, I'm going to go and create something here. I'm going to go and do a project that would normally just be sort of a line item in a foreign aid budget, and some money would get farmed there. I tell a story in the book about a girl who started an orphanage in Nepal and is now the legal guardian for 40 plus children, and was from New Jersey, moved there with her life savings. And that's sort of a great example of something that traditionally would have been a project that someone would decide we're either going to give money to this community or not. She went over there and had seen these people basically being forgotten and said, I'm not going to, hope that someone gives resources there. I'm just going to go there and act. And so there's a lot of sort of do-it-yourself. Nicholas Kristof wrote a story about this and called it sort of do-it-yourself foreign aid, which I think is a good way of putting it. So there's a lot of do-it-yourself problems, things that traditionally people found institutional support for, and that's really something that I think is new.
Is this on? Okay. Like some of the other questioners, I feel compelled to declare my generational affiliation.
Members of all generations.
Yeah, I'm a baby boomer, and I have 3 kids, one of which is a Gen Xer, the other 2 are millennials. So I feel connected in that respect.
Great. This is a trend, by the way, of stronger intergenerational relationships, which is also something
Yeah,
that's
well, I
important.
mean, the dialogues we have are fascinating. First, I'd just like, as a comment, to say that I think that Governor Dean's role in, creating the kind of political organization and the 50-state strategy that you advocated while you were in the DNC, and before that, actually, were prescient, and I think had an enormous influence on the Obama campaign, which I think hasn't been recognized enough. Having said that, my question is, in talking about political involvement, and you were saying how some of the millennials are sort of disillusioned, perhaps, and won't go into political work, and you use the example of Ted Kennedy, if he were a millennial today and what his role would be. I'm wondering if, because it seems to me that the organization that Obama put together in 2008, there was all this talk about this would continue from 2008 to the present, that people would be involved in making political decisions and so on and so forth, whereas it seems that some millennials have expressed criticism that Obama went too much the direction of Rahm Emanuel in making deals with Congress and that sort of thing, and lost touch with millennials and others, and revived that during his 2012 campaign. But I'm wondering what you think about the future. Do you think Obama is moving toward the direction of actually maintaining those kinds of contacts and political involvements to a greater degree than he did after 2008?
Do you want to take a first stab at that?
Obama's a transitional figure. He's very much like John F. Kennedy was for our generation. He was my father's age, but he was our first president because he saw everything differently, and we were coming out of the stodgy era of the McCarthy and the enormous conformist pressure of the McCarthy era. And what has happened to Obama is I believe he truly got the young vote the first time, because he truly did represent the new generation. He really is a guy who wants to work with other people, as these folks are. We, of course, would like to fight to the death over the 15% of stuff we absolutely disagree on, because we're culture warriors. And they're not, although they're not even Democrats. They just vote heavily Democratic because of the intolerance and bigotry on the other side. They don't respect that as a way of getting votes. And if you beat up on Muslims, gays, immigrants, you're unfortunately for the Republicans beating up on their friends. And they're not going to, these guys are actually gettable from a political point of view by the Republicans, because they're much more libertarian than we are in terms of the economy. So to answer your question, what the president found when he got there was a whole different world that he had no anticipation of, I don't know why he didn't know it was different, but he didn't. And there's a culture in Washington that it really is. Washington, I always say Washington's the last place in the country that anybody has any idea what's going on, and the two places that are tied for the bottom of that well are the United States Senate and the Washington Post editorial room. It's just extraordinary, I mean, how out of touch they are. And they're not stupid people. They're not crooks. They're not stupid, with a few exceptions of people who've said some very famous things in the last election. And they work hard. But there's this culture in there, in Washington, that is completely different than everything else. So all the standards are different, and that's where he got caught. And the only thing I'd say about the OFA, the problem is, the first time, and I think the second time will be the same, this is not a generation about issues, it's a generation about values. Yeah. And so they first start with the values and then they go to the issues. But the trouble is, so the president wins big time because his turnout among young people was even bigger the second time than it was the first time, much to everybody's surprise, all the pundits in Washington's surprise. But then that was an election about values, and the value differences were pretty clear between the two sides. And so now these things are issue to issue. So this is not a top-down generation. They don't look at us and say, well, let's learn from our elders. They respect us because we respect them. But they don't look at us as the model of how they want everything done. So for the president to think that he is going to have an organization that's going to get the word out to millions of loyal people who are under the age of 35, not going to happen, because they think, not only do they think for themselves, they act for themselves, and if they don't like something that's going on in Washington, they ignore it. And my view is that they've already affected the big banks. When Molly Catchpole went on change.org and had 300,000 people threaten to take their money out of the Bank of America, and they rescinded their debit card fee. And 2 days later, for some unbelievably inexplicable reason, Verizon decided to charge people $2 to pay their bill online, which we, of course, in my generation, we all would have paid our bill in the air, and it would have cost, by mail, it would have cost them zillions. It was an incredibly dumb thing to do. That went away in 48 hours. Same girl, Molly Catchpole, did that. So I don't think this is a generation this is not a generation who's looking to be led. This is a generation who's looking for a leader who's going to facilitate the things that they believe are important, and that's why I think that the approach doesn't work.
I think, just to add on to that, I think Governor Dean is absolutely right, but there's also a degree to which if we sort of see a leader and believe in that person and think, they're moving things forward, and then feel like they're not, the ability to sort of turn and say, you know what, we're going to go back to the things we were doing, it's pretty focused to be able to turn on a dime in that regard. And I think you saw a little bit of that between in 2000, when people were not seeing the president do as much as they might have hoped. I think that, first of all, this idea that millennials thought Obama was going to change everything, and then they were crestfallen that everything didn't change overnight, was way overplayed. And I mean, nobody thought that everything, at least in this generation, was not the common view that everything was going to change. I think people expected some level of disappointment and frustration and inability to get things done, and that's okay, because we have our own ability to move things forward. But this party should definitely not count this generation and say, we've got them. And I think Democrats in some cases are a little at risk of that, of thinking, we have these people for the long haul, they're voting for us. And it's true that millennials have voted more Democratic than Republican, but members of all political parties have to realize that this generation is very quick to move on if they feel like they're not being heard.
Any more questions? Let's take 2 more questions there.
So touching back to the Maggie Doyne example, which that was the girl that David referenced in Nepal, I think one trend that you bring to light, David, is this idea of do-it-yourself and all of these individualized, as Governor Dean said as well, these individualized models that maybe scale deep as opposed to scaling broadly. And what I mean by that is treating like a root cause and really addressing an issue at its core, providing a solution that's relevant to whichever city or state or wherever it is, as opposed to treating one symptom around the world. I'm wondering, though, what the balance is between these top-tier young people who are designing these solutions, and once they found the model that works, really being able to scale that without an institution facilitating it, so that we aren't redesigning the same wheel in context where we could just apply that solution more broadly.
So we're starting to see those models, I think, be applied in other places. If you think about the way that people are engaging in that kind of work, and the way you then see, the Bank of America example is sort of a little bit like this idea that, okay, so someone's out there creating an alternative payment model, I guess we have to do that too. So, and ultimately, I think the goal of any organization or any effort like that should be to put itself out of business, right? It's really to mainstream the values and the efforts of that, so that organization doesn't have to be doing it, that everybody is doing it, that the people who have power, the people who have big impact are doing that, because that would be ideal. And I think this is a generation that realizes, it's that if you could get Walmart to change the amount of energy it consumes, that could have a real impact on the environment. And people did do that, and millennials were part of pushing that. And whatever you want to think about Walmart, the fact that as one of the largest employers in the United States, they've dramatically reduced the amount of energy that they're consuming is not there's not a joke. I mean, that's an incredible. If you are serious about the root cause of how we make or have a better environment, that's a piece of it. And you can't ignore people because you disagree with their values or their other commitments on social issues. If people are willing to do those kind of things, then millennials are ready to embrace them. It's something I call in the book this idea of pragmatic idealism, that you have to fuse the ability to get things done with wanting to change the world, and you can't ignore these big institutions and big companies, even if, as we were talking about, they're imperfect and they don't work well. And it's not antithetical to hold those two beliefs at the same time.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll have these gentlemen sign their books. Any question? Yeah?
Yeah, I guess sort of a two-part question, more directed at Governor Dean regarding what you said. How going forward, can governments be adapted to better facilitate sort of the millennials' tendencies in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of, wanting to build these projects and change things through that way and through petition-based sort of organization. And you mentioned it's a much more libertarian generation, and I definitely see some of that in terms of the perception of government, and whether there's a social obligation to a society you didn't choose to be part of. But on the other hand, you see a lot of collective action where people do get to choose, like on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, where people will contribute not out of an expectation of profit, but because they want to be a part of something. So I'm kind of wondering whether there needs to be a change in terms is it really something fundamentally anti-government, or is it something in terms of the libertarian streak, or is it more of, are there ways government can adapt?
So I really think that it'd be better for David to answer the question about politics, because I can't wait to see what the answer is, because frankly, I don't know what the hell's going to happen. On the second, which I think is absolutely fascinating, I think this is a hard thing for people my age and a little younger to get their arms around or their head around. This generation doesn't think like that. They're not anti-government. They just, if they see, they don't have to rely on existing institutions, because they can go on the web and find 5,000 people who agree with them and then go do what they want. So, I mean, what I tell them when I go out and do get out the vote stuff is, you got to vote, because they may not be able to help you much, but they can hurt you. But what they need is
a good way of putting it.
What they need is a legislative framework that allows them to be as creative as they possibly can. That's what they need. And I mean, I think there's very little creativity. There's never been very much creativity in politics. I mean, we all lionize Franklin Roosevelt and maybe Lyndon Johnson, or for these, and Jefferson, but those are the reason we lionize them, because those are the exceptions. Most about politics in a democracy is simply to minimize violence. I mean, you have to understand that politics in this country is a substitute for war. Politics everywhere is a substitute for war. That's how it evolved. We don't allocate resources and leadership by killing each other in most parts of the world anymore, because democracy has done that. But democracy is an incredibly stodgy institution, because it takes so long to smooth out all the corners. So I guess I would just, so that's the part about the second part, but I'd love to hear David's answer on how this is going to change, because it's the one instance. I agree with everything David said about the media and the Wall Street and so forth. I can't honestly quite figure out what exactly is going to happen to government, other than the attrition of people like me out of government, and people who are 40 years old or younger, 30 years old, into government. That's going to take a long time, and I'm not entirely sure that we have that long to wait.
Well, I think it is, of all the things we just talked about, that's the biggest one, because there's this incredible moment right now where everything we're talking about, the sequester, the fiscal cliff, all these things, we've never had a period of political discussion that's more focused on demographic issues. We're in the middle of this country of a period of politics that's about, what are we going to invest in the people who are to come? Are we going to invest in the people who are here? And to what degree are we going to make those commitments? To what degree are we going to make promises to people in the future? This is not a generation, incidentally, that ever expects to get Social Security. And I think that when you look at this idea of entitlement, people call this generation entitled, this generation has absolutely absolutely no sense of entitlement to the government whatsoever. There is no expectation, people, that we're ever going to get anything from this government. So I think that's a shift. It would be a pleasant surprise if people did, but there's no sense of planning for that. People who are, to the degree that millennials are thinking about their long-term financial future, they're not, factoring in Social Security into that. So, but to sort of how it's going to change, honestly, I think it's about, at this point, finding some cracks in the system and sort of opening them up. I think we do have a system in which there's more transparency to some degree. There's more openness and accessibility. The fact that politicians are on social media and there is a good thing, but that's also had a lot of negative consequences. It's led to the inability of people to sit down and, hammer out a deal in the way that needs to get done. I think a lot of it is going to have to be replacing people who are in Congress with younger people who, not just because they're young and can represent the interests of young people, but because they have a better understanding of A, the world that we're living in right now, the world that everybody's living in, and B, have a fresh perspective on how we might be able to come up with solutions to some of these things. And the average age of Congress right now, incidentally, is the highest it's ever been. We just celebrated the incredible diversity of the 113th Congress that came in terms of gender and sexual orientation and minority status, which was all fantastic. But there's only one member of Congress who's under the age of 30. And unless that piece of it starts to change, we won't see any change. So one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is going around and trying to convince more young people to run for office and in this mold that we talked about. Because the other thing is that someone who is a young person on a career politics track is not any better than an old person who's on a career politics track. We need to change that sense of people who are getting into politics to ultimately get a great job as a lobbyist or, at the other end of that, who don't have as much at stake in terms, and they are free to sort of vote their mind and think their mind and make tough decisions, because that's what we're missing more than anything. It's an absence of political courage, and I think this generation's ready to take that up.
Thank you so much, both of you. It was terrific. Thank you.